And I'm delighted to be joined this evening by three very distinguished and knowledgeable panelists. Could I ask you to introduce yourselves, please? Chantal, do you want to kick off?
Hi, I'm Chantal Nicholson, a chef, restaurateur, currently restaurantless at the moment, which is really nice. And I've got a new site opening in spring next year, which is based around circular economy principles, hopefully some ethical hospitality. And I'm also an independent board member for London, which is obviously making London towards more of a circular economy.
My name is Shamal. I'm one of the co-founders of a restaurant business called Dishoom, and we have 8 sites in London and the UK. We've got 10 delivery kitchens as well, and we employ about 1,200 people now. And we're getting back to normal after coronavirus, and we're working pretty hard on thinking about carbon. We're working hard on different aspects of ethical hospitality, but I guess we'll get to all of that. But it's nice to be here and honoured to be with these panelists.
Hello, I'm Giles, the founder of the Sustainable Restaurant Association, and also the chief executive of Good Business. The SRA sort of does what it says on the tin. I'm sure we'll come on to talk a bit about that this evening. And Good Business is a sustainability strategy business that works with larger corporates. So I can sort of look at it from both angles. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So just in terms of the format for this evening, I'll spend about 10 minutes now just sort of setting the scene, and then I'll ask some questions of the panelists here, and we'll talk through those for maybe half an hour or so, and then we'll like to turn it over to all of you to be able to ask questions of the panelists for 15 or 20 minutes. We'll try and wrap up by 7:45, and then if you're interested in continuing any of the discussions, we'll be moving up to the 3rd floor, the Ubuntu Lounge, so please do come and find us there. Okay, so to set the scene, I'd like to try and address 3 questions. One is, what do we mean by ethical hospitality? Secondly, why might it be important? And thirdly, what might we try and achieve on this evening? And when I say I'm going to address those questions, I don't profess to be able to answer them completely at all. Rather, I suppose I'm trying to offer some thoughts and frame the discussion a little bit, and then sort of turn it over to all of you and the panel to get deeper into those topics. So if we start with kind of thinking about what we mean by ethical hospitality, I think that this critical word there is obviously ethical, and if you look up definitions of ethical and ethics, there are 2 themes which recur in most of the definitions. One of them is about a set of moral principles, and the second theme is that it's about what's good for individuals and for society. And I think those 2 themes have a couple of very important implications for us in this discussion this evening. One implication, I think, is that it's going to be a very wide-ranging debate. If I think about what's good for society, that's going to cover how we look after the planet, carbon footprint, recycling, use of plastics. It's going to cover the way we look after our teams, creating diverse teams, an environment in which they feel included, their well-being, the way we reward them. It's going to cover ethical sourcing. It's going to cover animal welfare, healthy menus, food waste, and supporting and giving back to the communities that we're connected to. So very wide-ranging discussion. And I think the second implication of those 2 themes is that this is going to be a subjective debate. The question of kind of where we set the bar for what good is in each of those areas, different people will see that differently. And I think that's an interesting part of the challenge for all of us. Okay, so moving on to kind of why this might be important. And I think there are several angles to this. Is it important for our customers? Yes, I think it is. I think there's plenty of evidence that says these are all topics of growing interest to our customers. I think there's an interesting question about whether it actually drives behaviour, though. There was a survey that Deloitte did at the beginning of this year, and turns out that when it comes to restaurants and takeaways, only 11% of consumers say that they had actively made a choice to use a brand that had ethical values or practices. And that compares with something like 58% for brands in clothing and footwear. So quite a huge disparity there that I find quite interesting and might be worth exploring. Is it important because of our teams? And I think, again, that's part of it. I think the industry, as we all know, attracts a disproportionately high number of young people, and young people are particularly passionate about these topics. And we know from our experience at Nando's that, that tapping into those passions has been hugely beneficial. They've really helped us to address these issues and come up with creative solutions that helped us to move forward on many of them. So I think that's part of it. Is this about the reputation of the sector? And again, I think that's part of it. If we could improve the reputation of the sector, could that help with challenges like attracting more talent into the sector? Is this important for investors and lenders? Again, I think there's evidence that investors and lenders are paying more and more attention to these topics. I think at the moment it's probably largely defensive in my experience, that investors and lenders don't want to be investing in businesses that have significant risks in these areas. Could it be something that investors and lenders think more opportunistically about, more proactively? So maybe a question to consider. I should also declare an interest in this topic on behalf of the Conduit. We have a stated aim, and it's part of our vision, to be an industry leader in sustainable and ethical hospitality. That's not to say that we don't recognise that there are challenges in this area, and I would encourage us all to ask challenging questions this evening so that we can get to better answers. An obvious challenge is there's a tension between short-term profitability, which is important for every commercial enterprise, and setting the bar as high as possible in all of those areas that I mentioned earlier. So I think just recognising that those tensions are there. And something that I think is quite encouraging on that front is that there is a growing body of evidence that says that businesses that create value for society, for large numbers of stakeholders, actually end up thriving and providing better returns to investors. I'm thinking about work like Grow the Pie by Alex Edmonds, Paul Polman, and Andrew Winston, Net Positive. So I think that's really encouraging. And I think those authors would say, none of that is easy. It takes effort, it takes skill, it takes time, but it can be done. So this evening, what can we try and achieve? First thing I would say is, on any topic that's wide-ranging and complex, simply exploring those topics, sharing ideas, questions and challenges, that in itself is valuable. Secondly, I would say, a lot of those challenges and opportunities are system-wide. And if we want to shift a system, we're probably going to have to collaborate. So if we can start to identify any of those and work together on them, then I think that would be a great result for us. On that topic, I do recognise that there are lots of organisations and people already trying to facilitate collaboration on lots of those topics. I'm thinking of the UK Hospitality Association, the Sustainable Restaurant Association, the Zero Carbon Forum, lots of people and organisations. I, for one, would love to learn more about those, and it could be that some of us here in the room this evening can help with some of them, and it could be that more is needed. So it'd be great to explore those things. Finally, then, my sort of requests of everyone this evening, all of you, please do contribute. Please contribute your ideas, your questions, your challenges, and where possible, please help us move the discussion to be as solutions-oriented as possible. I'm not pretending that we're going to find magical new solutions this evening, but if this evening can be one step in the process towards finding better solutions, then I think that would be very worthwhile. And my final request this evening is, going back to the idea that a lot of this is subjective, I would ask us all just to respect everybody's opinions on these topics. So with that, I'd like to open up the sort of debate with the panelists here. Chantal, could I start with you, please? You've run a restaurant, you're about to open a new one. What are your priorities in all of this, and how are you approaching those priorities?
It's kind of the million-dollar question. I think priority-wise for me, I think our industry's seen a shift in the past, well, since COVID. Some of it positive, some of it really positive, actually. I think my kind of priority is to be able to create something that is not only sustainable, but it's kind of regenerative. So in terms of it's not only keeping something the way it is, it's kind of improving something. And trying to find the best ways of doing things from a circular economy point of view, which for me is just kind of commonsensical, that we reuse and we keep things within the economy for as long as possible. It just kind of makes a lot of sense when you step back and look at it. I think people are the heart of what we do. Hospitality is all about people and how you make people feel. And I think for a very long time, our industry's focused a lot on the guests and customers, and not enough on our teams and the people that actually make those experiences happen. So from my perspective, it is looking at the circular economy, which obviously brings into account consumption-based emissions, which obviously leads to carbon, and then the team and how can we as a team, as one, create something that is rewarding, inspiring, motivating, fun, and actually that then lends itself to being able to translate into the guest experience as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. Makes a lot of sense. Shamil, can I ask you to take it on from there? As someone running a sort of successful multi-site business and brand, love to hear more about your priorities in this area, and how you set the bar for where good is in particular, because I know you're doing some interesting work with that.
Thank you. I'd sort of, when we were talking about this question, I struggled a bit with the frameworks. I thought about ethics, and I went back to Kant and Hume from the 18th century, and universalizability. So Kant says you should do things, and ethical things are those things that you wish everybody else would do. Any other sort of philosophy people out there, but I think that's fair. Like these are stuff that I would want other people to do. But then I thought, well, look, hospitality, and I think we're working in the framework of capitalism, right? Can we just declare that? So this is about capital and capitalism, and I think my belief is there's a lot wrong with it, and that's a great discussion. But maybe more interesting, we should discuss what's wrong with capitalism. But my belief is that capital can be used as an engine to harness power that can solve the world's problems, because it's a really powerful force. And I think that fundamentally, if I'm thinking about what's ethical in hospitality, and if I come down to it, it's a bit binary. If I'm doing good things, ethical, which are above and beyond what other people do, it's either monetizable or it's not. So if my EBITDA margin is 10%, and if my doing an ethical thing takes me to 11, then it's a no-brainer, obviously, then I'm going to do it. If it takes me to 9%, it's charity. and I'm in a social enterprise. And there's nothing wrong with that, and we do plenty of that stuff, but that's what I'm doing. So if I'm being really clear about it, like I think we have to sort of think that clearly. And then I think for the holy grail, I think, is, so there's some issues that you might not care about, and we all care about different issues. And I never used to care about animal welfare until I read *Sapiens*, and then realized we were exploiting big species. It was a horrific thing, and what we do to chickens and cows is horrendous. But that was not on my radar screen. So maybe things are not on your radar screen, don't worry about them. But the things that are on your radar screen, I think you've got maybe two choices, if you think they're important. The first, I think, is just to try and monetize them. And the second is to pay money to help that problem. And I think the holy grail is even when you think customers don't care about an issue, even when you think that it's not necessarily monetizable, if you go ahead and shove it in the middle of your business model and do something with it, and I think there's really good examples. Oatly is a good example where they've led. Another good example, I think, is Tom's Shoes is a good example. There are businesses that have done that, which I think is really cool. And what our example of that, I think, is where we do a meal for a meal. So every time we feed a customer in Disham, we feed a child in London or in the UK or in India, and we're up to 11 million meals. And that, we were discussing it earlier, and it's a sort of, I think it's about £1.5 million, something like that we've donated. Now, is that social enterprise or is that monetizable? I don't know. Did it add that much value to our bottom line? I mean, I'd like to think so, and it burnishes the brand, but I can't, hand on my heart, say that. Another thing that is definitely monetizable and is good is treating people well and being a great employer. And we recently made it to the number 4th best employer in the UK on the Times Top 100 list, and the best employer in hospitality. And I think that's brilliant. And I would urge everyone to do that because it will work. And I think that will pay back fairly, very quickly. So I think there's sort of a range of issues. And then I think maybe we'll get to this too, but let me just mention it. Well, let me put in one more thing. I think if we can lead on those issues, then capital can really be the engine of change. Then really, really cool. And you have to convince customers they care about it, convince people you've got a differentiated product, maybe even charge some more about it, and more for it. And then I think you can create real change. The one issue which I think is maybe apart from all of this is the issue of carbon and greenhouse gases. And I think that's a different issue of a different order entirely. I think it's beyond ethics. I think it's into sort of emergency. We're heading to the iceberg. We're on the Titanic. And we can say, is it ethical to try and get the ship away from the iceberg? Well, it's not. It's just survival. I mean, it's a real flipping problem. And at this point, we've had COP26, lovely. And Paul has told me that some good things will come out of that, and I hope they will. But we do have a problem, and we're the people in the room who can do something about it to some extent. So I think we have to. I think we have to just put that in the middle of everything we do. 50 billion tons of carbon, greenhouse gases, and my problem is 21,000 tons. My customers are 7 kilos a meal, and we all have to think that way. And I want to reduce that to 3 or 4 kilos a meal. Offsets are a load of baloney. So if you eat a steak, it's 50 grams. 50 grams of protein for a steak is 25 kilos of carbon. And you can offset away, fine, but that's not going to help because we need the offsets to get to the Paris targets anyway. So I think all of that stuff needs to become incredibly central. And we all need to be feeling pretty guilty when we eat a steak. And I like steak, by the way. And you can't just offset your way out of it. So we can come back to all that stuff. But that's my sort of nutshell, how we're thinking about it. And really excited to be driving what we think is ethical hospitality, but very conscious that I think the most powerful thing to do is to be able to monetize it and demonstrate to other people that there is profit in this, because then you will harness the profit motive.
Yeah, lovely. Would love to come back to some of that.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Shona. Giles, you have a macro view and you've been involved in these discussions for many years now. What's your perspective on the opportunity here?
Well, I think I'm not quite sure how to come after all of that. There was a torrent of so many ideas and thought. I was sort of trying to slightly take it in, but you've done it all. No, I think it's we're at a really interesting moment. I set up a restaurant 25 odd years ago that was called The Good Cook, and it was an attempt to try and think through all of the social and environmental impacts that a restaurant would have, and try and do it in a positive way. And we made a complete fluff of it, and it was bloody hard work, but some really interesting things came out of it. And The food, Allegra McEvedy was our chef who went on to found Leon, and it was in the Tabernacle in Power Square in a community centre, and all the food came from the local Portobello market, and we worked with the Portobello Trust for to get all the staff, for long-term unemployed. But what was interesting in that was that we literally would, it was a blank sheet of paper, and we were talking about ethical hospitality, and just going, you know, what are the issues? What are some ideas to deal with it? Because no one was really thinking about it in that sort of systemized way. We closed it because it cost a lot of money, but the outcome of that was then the development of the Sustainable Restaurant Association. It really was to try and say, look, it's hard enough running a restaurant and keeping the thing going, let alone having moral and ethical discussions about where you're getting the stuff from and how you're employing people and, you know, what's our position on carbon and all these different things. And so really the idea was, could we help already stressed businesses to simplify the way in which they went through those issues and give them solutions to enable them to move forward positively in doing that. And if they did that, we could then highlight that to diners, employees, and others in the sector to show that there are some people leading. And Chantal, hearing you talk about what we would call a restorative restaurant, you know, one that is not trying to minimize the negative impacts, but is actually trying to create a positive impact from every interaction, is absolutely the direction of travel. But the truth is we've got 150,000 restaurants in this country, and we need a greater percentage who are actually thinking about their sustainability, let alone the restorative nature of what they are. So I think my main point is, let's not dwell too much on what isn't ethical hospitality. I think there's been quite a lot of work done on lots of the different elements. The question is, how do we help this sector to move forward in an accelerated way, especially amongst really important issues like carbon? And I think I keep on coming back to the same thing in hospitality, is that, you know, we're not a kind of hidden industry. We are a very public industry. People sit down in our restaurants and have conversations, and I think we can create the place where they have the conversation about the world that they want to be in. And that's why we set up that restaurant in the Good Cook so many years ago, was to prove that there was such a thing as that they could form part of what the future might look like. And I think we've got to use the fact that our places, the walls, the staff, what's on the plate, are all decisions that consumers are making, and we need more consumers to make more positive decisions. And then I think the industry can perform this accelerating role, not in changing sustainability and sort of ethics and the impact of capitalism in the restaurant sector, but actually in many sectors that we touch and the people who come into our restaurants touch. So it's a real leader if it wants to be. And at the moment, it isn't, if I'm honest. The sector isn't. There are some great stars within it, but the sector itself is not moving fast enough forward.
Yeah, thank you, Giles.
Can I come back?
Yeah.
But I suppose, I mean, I've got to ask as well, how do you get, because a really key question, because I agree the sector needs to change. And I think particularly with the carbon issue, I think we should just regulate, frankly. I mean, finally, that's not going to work unless we all regulate, because people want cheap food. But I guess with the sector, how do you illustrate to the broad sector, including multiple units like Wagamama's or Nando's, etc., that they should be taking this path? Because finally, you've got to appeal to profit-making motive, don't you? Yes, I think that funny enough, the bits of the sector that are probably moving faster forward than not are the Wagamamas, etc., where they've got people and specialists and support to enable them to think about these issues enough to do something about it. Right? If you're an independent restaurant, how can you think about all these things and try and run a restaurant at the same time? So, actually, I think the sort of larger businesses are, you know, showing the way, and that it is having positive impact on their staff, on the relationships they have with their suppliers, and beginning, and I think this is the key point, coming out of the pandemic, I think we've all
had a moment where we have had time to pause, and people are saying, I'm not just going to say that I want to buy the good thing, but I'm actually going to try and do it, right? And through the other work that I do, it's amazing to see in the last 4 months how much change there has been in sectors where there is a sustainable offering and people going towards that. Be that that Tesla is the #1 selling new car in the UK in September. Be it that second-hand fashion sites are now selling more than fast fashion. So we're seeing people coming out and going, okay, if you give me an option, I'll go for it. This challenge in the food sector is that we haven't yet got that currency. So I still come to your wonderful restaurants because I think they're wonderful and the food's great and there's a really great atmosphere. I'm not coming because of the way that I think you're running it from an ethical perspective. And I think we've got to find a way to try and link up the changes that we need to make to the decisions that diners want to make, because they're making it in other sectors. We know that they're making it in other sectors. So if we give them, on open table, it allows you to, filter it by, if you care about animal welfare, you could filter it by that.
Kilos of carbon.
Or kilos of carbon. All of these things. Then I think people will move to it. And at the moment, we don't have a system that links the decisions that the restaurant are making to how the consumer is making a decision about where they go. Once you achieve that, then your EBITDA question is solved.
Yeah. Thank you, Giles. I want to come back to the point you made about simplicity as well, and maybe ask Chantal if you could comment on this as well, because as Giles points out, there's a raft of different issues there, and they're quite complex to deal with. And here you are about to set up a new restaurant, and you're going to be struggling just to find enough people to come and work there. How do you deal with all of that? Or what would help?
Not quite sure yet. I think, how do I deal with it? I guess you have to have a bit of faith, and you've got to have a bit of hope that, by doing the right thing, by being ethical, by acting with empathy and integrity, which I think kind of sums up the ethics of it in many ways, that things will happen. And I think unless you kind of, unless people go out there and try it, nothing will shift. And I think, yes, we've got the big chains, and I think, Giles made that point, that they have the resource, they have the time, they have sustainability teams, they have, all these people with, whereas kind of being an independent operator, it can be like, where do you find the time to even read about what you need to do and then follow all those procedures? It's economies of scale. I think until more people jump on that bandwagon, it's not even a bandwagon, jump on the ship to be able to save ourselves, then not much is going to change. So unless, I guess sometimes you kind of think, well, it's a balancing act, 100%. And I think there are, the EBITDA question is, if you're going to, you can gain 1% here, but you'll lose 1% here. So if that keeps you at neutral, that's a good thing. If you've made the decision you feel works for you. And I think it's a bit of trial and error as an independent operator, but I think you made that point that, we're only going to achieve things with collaboration. And it's only by collaboration that I'm in the position to be able to open a new site. So, I'm very grateful for that, and I think that I feel I'm slightly obliged in a good way to be able to push the boundaries and just see what's possible. But in terms of, prioritising, it is a balancing act, and some things you feel great about, some things you don't, but at the end of the day, unless you kind of try it, nothing's probably going to shift.
Yeah, very much. I'd love to come back to some of that, but Shamil, at the risk of bringing more philosophy into the debate.
Let's get back to it.
No, I'm inviting you to do that, and not me. Can you share a little bit with the room about some of the challenges that you've struggled with or are struggling with currently in this sort of space?
I think the baseline of business is really hard. So hospitality plus COVID equals a great deal of paracetamol. It's a massive headache. And the 2 years have been ridiculous, and I think before, I'm a great believer in rhythm, and I really previously prided myself on our management team that we used to be like a really great 8 boat down the Thames, and we were sort of going along, and it was beautiful to watch, and there was rhythm, there was KPIs and reporting, and we were in the restaurants making sure everything was great, and then suddenly there was a flippin' white water rapid, and an 8 boat was the last thing you want to be in a rapid with, so we sort of crashed the boat, got out, got some dinghies, and have been rafting ever since. And I think that in that situation, which is real, how do you think about ethical hospitality? What does that even mean in that situation? And plans. I had a sort of climate epiphany before COVID hit. I had read a great book called The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. And I would urge you all to read it, because I feel like my life was before I read that and after I read that. And we really only have 10 years to solve everything. And your kids will ask you, what did you do about it? When did you know? What did you do about it? And you've got to be able to look them in the face and say something. Otherwise, they'll be pretty upset, because I think it's a massive flipping problem. I mean, it really is. I can't sort of overstate that. And then I read the book by a great guy called Mike Berners-Lee, who we're working with. Some of you will know him, called There Is No Planet B. He's very critical of the David Wallace Wells. He thinks it's a bit alarmist, because some of the science. And then I went into what bits of the science were alarmist, and it's not that alarmist. It's still pretty much realistic. So read it, and it'll give you a sense of the Titanic into an iceberg in 10 years' time. But unfortunately, the reason I sort of make that point is because those plans were put on hold, because we had the practical, what do we do with the business? The thing I'm most proud of is that I made a commitment, as a senior team, we made a commitment to the teams and said, we're going to keep everyone's job. We're not going to lay everyone off. We're going to top everyone up to a certain amount, and we did that. We didn't lay anyone off, even in head office, and we managed to make the sort of numbers work. It was pretty hard, and had to duck and dive. We invented a delivery business as a result. But look, this is all hard. So balancing all these ethics are incredibly difficult. I think there are trade-offs involved as well. So I've discovered that the happiest chickens are not the ones that will help the planet, right? So that's a problem. So how much do I care about happy chickens? I mean, a lot, because now I think we exploit them as a species. It's really horrible what we do to chickens. But I don't think I care about them as much as I care about the future of our children. And that's a problem, and we need to be a bit clear-eyed about that stuff. And so I think these issues come to the fore, and you've got to navigate them. And I guess what I would urge any people navigating hospitality, and if you've been doing that, I know it's been hard. You have my empathy and compassion. We've been in the same storm, but I think you've got to sort of set your compass and say, that's where we're navigating, this is what we're doing, this is important, we're here to make money, but these are really important issues. So now let's figure out how we monetize them. And if we can't do that, look, we're going to take a little bit of less EBITDA, and I try and pretend that's not happening, and we'll monetize and we'll work really hard. But I think that's where the creativity and the coolness is that when you figure out what's right to you, what the planet needs, amongst those various stakeholders that you're involved with, and that's including the animals you kill, how do you then create a great business out of that, which can then lead and demonstrate to other people that you can do it? And it's hard, right? Because you've got to worry about furlough and coronavirus and shutting down restaurants and Omicron. But at the same time, I think you've got to keep that up there as, hey, this is really cool and this is important. And Chantal is a wizard at that, better than I am, because it's circular, very cool. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Well, again, I'd love to come back to some of that. But Giles, any sort of perspective from you on you've kind of heard some of the operators, the people running businesses talk about some of the challenges that they're experiencing. Any thoughts on what we can do with the system and all of us to help with that?
I think it's to not get bogged down in trying to have sort of lots of different sets of priorities, but trying to agree, if we could agree an industry priority, which might not please everyone all the time, but if we at least sort of went, do you know what? Yes, carbon's number one, sort of mental health of staff is number two, and animal welfare, that there was at least some prioritization going on, that we could then focus some of or as much attention on creating real and genuine impact. Because I find that too much of our time and energy is spent in having the conversation about almost what's important or not, rather than going, come on, of all these, let's say there's 20 big issues, let's really sort of focus in on 5 of them, because they're really bloody important, and actually we're going to fall down either society's going to fall down or our industry's going to fall down. I mean, talking to Raymond Blanc about the manoir, and he's saying, you know, we've come out of, he got COVID extremely badly and was in on life support for a month. He's come out going, I don't want to do what I did before. I worked 100 hours and I expected everyone at the manoir to work 80 hours. How can I, you know, that's why young people aren't coming into the sector. You know, there's as much of a carbon emergency as there is a mental health emergency in our sector. And actually people are going, no, I don't need to do this anymore. So I think we've got to work out which are the important ones and then try to get everyone on board to do stuff about it, right? And that's the bit that I keep on coming back to, how best to do that without telling people what to do, or regulation in a sense. It's like, how can we embolden the sector to do it and then celebrate those people who are actually doing it? Look, all these restaurants are net zero restaurants. Brilliant. That's a really clear thing. I can see that there's a carbon, so they've done something about carbon. Similarly on mental health. You know, let's find what those ones are and then make the change and then identify which restaurants are there. And then I think we can create that dynamic in the sector.
Come back on that. I'm not sure I agree with Jazz, because I feel that, well, one is I agree with the prioritisation, don't get me wrong, but I think some of these issues are just too important to not regulate. Because fundamentally, we're not going to change our behaviour unless there's real change at the legislative level. I mean, I think maybe what we should be doing is you know, publishing our carbon footprints, you know, what we're doing. I think net zero is a bit of a tricky one, because you need like, I'm not convinced about offsets. I don't know if they are a thing.
We'll take that offline.
Yeah, that's a good debate, right, because there's different views on that.
But unless you all want to talk about it. But
yeah, it's a really good debate, yeah. But look, I don't know if offsets are legitimate or they work, because we need them all to get to the Paris, you know, or whatever we're going to get to anyway. But I think that for us to, I would love us as an industry to go to government and say, hey, look, this is what we can achieve. This is where we need a nudge. This is where we need a subsidy, and this is where we need regulation. So we need to have this. Otherwise, you're going to get free riders.
Absolutely.
So I mean, if to solve a problem as big as this, we're going to need, and in the end, to solve a problem as big as this, we all need carbon taxation.
Yeah. But we need it not just in this sector. And I suppose if Henry Dimbleby was sitting here, he would say that's what the National Food Strategy was trying to do, was to identify those areas where we needed to nudge, those areas where we need regulation in order to create that system change. So I'm totally understand that regulation is a part of it. But we're not sitting here as government. We're sitting here in the sector going, we need to make an impact now. We can't wait for regulation to come down the line. How are we going to do that? What are we going to do it on? How can we get, you know, as many restaurants involved and engaged as possible? And I suppose that's why I keep on coming back to this thing about, we've got to make it easy to do. Ask other sectors, because this, to your collaboration point, in the end, the restaurant is just the front door. It's the front door to what the farmers are doing. It's the front door to what the electric companies are doing in terms of providing it. It's the front door to all these industries. And we need to ask them to be the solution, and that we then deliver those solutions in the restaurant and then sort of be identified for making those changes. And rather than thinking that we've got to solve it all ourselves, because otherwise I think we're going to be struggling.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. This is a question actually for the three of you, the different perspectives. Keen to follow up on that idea of sort of trying to identify, you know, half a dozen topics on which, as an industry, we try and agree these are some standards that we are going to try and achieve across the board. Charles, you've been trying to do that with the SRA for many years. So I'd love to hear about the challenges you've experienced and how we overcome those. And Sharmil and Chantal, would love to hear whether you feel, from an operator's point of view, you'd be happy to engage in that kind of process, or what would get in the way?
Yeah, so we have got a standard, and you know, I'm sure you've all heard about B Corps. You know, B Corp's quite hard work to do. The SRA rating is quite hard to do. There's, you know, a lot of issues, a lot of questions. So I don't think we're helping ourselves in terms of making that easy. But as we've said, it's complicated. I do think that if we could have a a clearer conversation about which ones are more important than others, and then find solutions to make it work, then that would really help the sector. Rather than, there are lots of organisations out there that are brilliant, and we've got 14,000 kitchens that are using the rating in some form in the UK. But there's 150,000, and if we want impact, we need something that's simple and easy that every restaurant can or should do, and to do that. And it's not rocket science in a sense. It is things like carbon. It is how we employ people. It is the food that we're putting on there. It is the environmental impact of the kitchen itself. So yes, it's complicated, but I think there's been a lot of work done into trying to systemize it and see what those impacts are. And I think my main point that I'd love to think about is how we stop it being qualitative rather than and make it more quantitative. Because once it's quantitative, we can get it's clear, you can measure it, you can be transparent about it, you can regulate it, and that doesn't work for all issues. But I think we've got to accept that we need numbers in order to move these organisations forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think from my perspective, what my frustration is that there's so much chat about what's wrong and where we're going, but there's not enough about what do we do. There's no kind of straightforward, right, follow this criteria and you'll get there. And obviously, yes, some of it is subjective. How can you quantify someone's mental health? That's a tricky one. But I think there are very objective things that we can do. And I guess, in a way, this is going back a number of years, and I've just plucked this out the top of my head, but when the allergen legislation came in, it's like, okay, there's the allergens we need to identify. We identify them, and that's what we do. It's almost kind of breaking it down so it's something as simple as that anyone can follow it, whether you're a kind of single independent operator or a chain, that it becomes, and everybody's on the same page with it. Everybody understands how to do it.
Yep. Thank you.
I think I'm in agreement with most of what you guys are saying. I think from my point of view, how I think about so we have a philosophy. I've sort of hatched this as a sort of I think I declared this was a great idea some years ago, and everyone sort of believed me, and it went from there. But which is that we try and maximize welfare for the customer. Then we maximize welfare for the employee. Those two are ones that we obsess over in our dashboard. So we start with that. We say we're going to obsess over this. Like, this is really important. We're going to make that as good as we possibly can. And with the customer, it includes value for money and how much enjoyment they have, etc. And we can measure that in our business. And then we maximize the welfare for the employees. So we measure that as well, and we try and we measure it through some of these external things and Glassdoor, and we've got a nice Glassdoor score. And then we make a contribution to society. So we do a meal for a meal. We do some other charity work as well. And I think the planet now is becoming central to that. And I think maybe that's even above all of this. And then we fix our margin. And we don't maximize margin. So what I'm trying to do there is saying, look, I'm happy with this margin, which is pretty good. And I believe that that's an industry-leading margin. Did some benchmarking a few years ago, and we get to an industry-leading margin. But we don't do that through maximizing margin. I think that's a mug's game. I think the best way to do it is by maximizing welfare to customers, maximizing welfare to employees, and doing good for the planet. And that recipe should be industry-leading margins. And I think that's the cool bit in business. If you can create a model which gets to high margins and you're maximizing everybody else's welfare, that's absolutely brilliant. And if I was an anti-capitalist, I'd say, well, you're monetizing virtue, aren't you? And I'm saying, yeah, exactly the point. Because I think if you can illustrate that good creates industry-leading returns, then everyone will be good. And some of you nice private equity people out there might invest in businesses that do good, and so forth. I think that's, for me, the sort of way of doing it. And for me, to the extent that dovetails, I can jive with that. So I think that then it makes sense. And if carbon comes to the top of that because it's important, and we can then begin to show that we treat our people well, and that's important, then that sort of makes sense. But it's sort of, I think, as individual sort of entrepreneurs and restaurateurs, you've got to find your version of that recipe and then drive that, and drive it really flipping hard, unapologetically. And our dashboards that we look at have revenue and profit at the bottom. So our operating philosophy is is awesome food and drink, awesome service, happy team, control the costs, and the revenue and the profit, the applause that follow, and we structure everything that way. So we only have conversations in that order, where we start with the stuff we obsess over, and then there's the stuff we control, and then the applause somewhere at the bottom, which is really applause. We don't drive that, which is I don't know if I answered the question at all, but I sort of, but that's how we think about the whole thing.
Where would the produce fit into happy customers, employees, in that, as in thinking about, I mean, would that come under the planet one, that it's like, because actually your impact is probably greatest through, not in the restaurant, but actually in the fields and the food kind of getting to the
in a carbon way, absolutely.
In a carbon way.
Yeah. So I think and again, I'm sort of I'm trying to think about the different issues. I think the carbon issue is really important. So we're looking at that now and looking at every single meal, and we're on a journey to reduce that. We will do some offsets as well, and we might get to net zero, but not that I think it's a thing. So we can have sort of fisticuffs in the bar after that. But I think that for me, I'll be quite sort of clear about what I care about. So the produce, the carbon issue is central. The fair trade issue is probably less important to me, but interesting, and look at that, and that's a nice to have, but I'm not sort of working at that. That's not fitting into that. But I think, again, I'm sort of picking my battles, and I'm conscious that if I'm trying to provide value to the customer, I can't pick all the battles. It's quite hard to do. So I do go through that, and we're not an expensive restaurant. It's like we can't afford to buy really fancy ingredients for everything, but we do what we can and focus on the things where we really can move the needle.
Brilliant, thank you. There's so much more there that I would love to explore with you, but I'm also very conscious of wanting to give the audience here an opportunity to ask questions. Does anybody out there have any questions that they'd like to ask? Sorry, go ahead. I think there was an early hand here.
Joanne and I are going to declare, sorry, my name is Bob Gordon, I used to work with Joanne at Nando's, and I declare up front that I was going to heckle. And you've totally thrown my head, actually, because you completely blown my mind. You've blown my heckle, because you've blown my mind on in terms of the conversation, so thank you. The thing I think I want to lean into is this EBITDA question, because I think that's central. Giles, you asked kind of how do we get to scale, and I think if we can demonstrate the profitability of being ethical, then people will come towards it. And I don't necessarily think that's about convincing customers. I think it's about having a decent business. And Shamil, you've talked about how we do all these things first to make sure we have a good business, and we think we have industry-leading EBITDA. Well, of course you do. You do all these things to make sure you have a good business. They just happen to be the right things. And I also remember, as I hear you talk, a podcast I listened to a long time ago with a VP for sustainability at McDonald's. And he said, for every dollar we invest in sustainability, we see a $2 return, but we see a lag of 3 to 5 years. I don't know how they work that out, but I think, Giles, you've probably got enough experience with the SRA and good business to have enough data to be able to ask that question, how do we work this out? How do we start to map across lots of different businesses how they've approached it and how it's impacted their bottom line? There you go. It's a thought rather than a question.
Yeah, I mean, there are people far better qualified from a quant perspective, accountants, management consultants, who are trying to answer this question, not just in the hospitality world, but I think in many other sectors. And I think that the point is that good input do create good businesses in a myriad of ways, and that is an increasingly proven statement, right? And I'm not going to go through the many list of things that come from running a good business. So I think the macro equation is there, and I think that there's enough people out there that believe it. I think the question is the jump from that to running a restaurant, right? And that something gets lost a bit in that. And that's because it's hard, it's short-termist, there are millions of decisions that are made, from lots of different difficult issues, and no one's got the right answer, as you say, Chantal. Different people you talk to have got different things. Carbon's more important than this, or etc. So it's when you get down to the practical level that I think it starts to become more difficult. But the fundamental point that I think you've made tonight, which is one that I can absolutely endorse, is you go at it and you put good inputs in and you'll get good profits out, right? But you've got to believe in that and go for it in a holistic way, not in a I'm going to do one thing and I'm going to think that I'm going to see the benefit coming out in money. It's got to be broader than that. And I think your model is a model. It's and there are other models out there. And I think it's the pick those things, go for it, and then it's the totality of those where the benefits will come through. Do you want to add anything or other questions?
Yeah.
Thank you. It's been very interesting. I'd like to go a bit off-piste because you've been talking about sort of the restaurants' operations as they are now. But I had an interesting conversation with Daniel Barber, from Blue Hill Stone Barn, about waste, about the use of sort of what are usually, quote, wasted ingredients. And so I'm curious what you think about that, but also about really going off-piste and looking at alternative sources of protein, say entomophagy, or other non-conventional ways. Because entomophagy from a sort of environmental standpoint is extremely good, but how many people can we convince to eat insects? And then if you go even more off-piste, I was asked to invest in a cell-based meat startup. So curious sort of what of those sort of alternatives, all of which are more environmentally friendly than the current standards, sort of where do you sort of sit on those?
Yeah, I think the ingredients that are deemed to be waste is a huge opportunity. I think going back to EBITDA, if you can get your food margins to a place that you're not, you're using good quality produce, but you're using things that potentially someone may not have used, you're going to increase your margins. So it kind of just makes sense from a holistic perspective that you get more out of a certain thing than you would have before. And there's a huge amount of products that can be deemed as waste, which are actually not, and are actually delicious and edible, and you can do a lot with them. And it's actually, I love that challenge of being able to think that way. In terms of I guess alternate proteins, cell-based meat. I think there's some amazing work being done with agroecology that actually potentially, if more time and thought went into that versus trying to find an alternative, we might be able to get a bit further. But again, I guess it's people seeing the return on that is a bit different. I think the system used to work. If you think of going back many, many years when there was less waste and people kind of valued food, I think if we can return to that kind of ideology, then we'll be in a better place. But it's just, how do we get there?
Just can I add to that? Food waste is horrific, and we need to do more. And there are lots of really interesting concepts and ideas that are, helping restaurants deal with it, see where the issue is, and change the way they do it. We have to remember that a third of food waste gets lost in getting to the restaurant. Particularly in southern countries, developing countries, and therefore we've got to look at it throughout the value chain, not just at the restaurant end, although there's a huge amount that can be done there. In terms of alt protein, I think that where I get to is that we need lots of solutions for lots of these issues. And therefore, it's a really important point. I think some people will have ethical issues when you then start getting into the cell stuff, but other people won't. So, I think being clear and transparent about when you're using things and when you aren't is they've all got a role to play. But I do think one of the key things is actually trying to change people's diet rather than trying to say we're trying to make people stay with the same diet, but just change what the thing is that they're eating within it. And I think what's been so interesting, having been in food for the last 25 years, is how in the last 2 or 3 years we have seen genuinely people being open to change their diet in a way that they haven't in the 20 years previously. And it happens, but very slowly, and I think it's happening much faster. And actually, it would be it's much easier and much simpler if we can actually persuade people to eat delicious food that doesn't impact the planet, etc. in that way. And restaurants can play an incredibly important role, I think, in helping not just reduce the amount of carbon in the food that they're eating, but actually persuade people to eat delicious food that is
Do you know,
low carbon.
if everybody only ate dal from Dishoom, we wouldn't have a planetary problem. They wouldn't need a national food strategy.
Thank you. Really, really fascinating. I had just a comment on the question earlier, or the thought earlier about the EBITDA margin. I'm wondering whether it would be possible to apply startup financial modelling to that kind of scenario, where you make various assumptions about what percentages, say, you have as an impact if you treat your people well, on perhaps the reduction in recruitment costs or various different things like that. And you can obviously extrapolate that into other lines of the accounting. I'm just wondering whether there's a way of looking at businesses that have already made profits. Some of the examples perhaps in those books, like Net Positive that were mentioned earlier, to see whether there are kind of average percentages that could be extracted to at least demonstrate something statistically. So that's just a thought. I mean, you can kind of argue how accurate that would be, but then, you know, other things like carbon footprinting is still also based on many general averages as well. So just a thought to think about on that. And then the question that I had was actually around data and the role of, I mean, you talk about the supply chain, Giles, and how much of an impact restaurants have in the fields, but gathering that data and really ensuring you know that data about the supply chain is quite difficult. That's one of the things that we've been focusing on, actually, is how do you gather the data in a way that can be shared so that it's easy to use to calculate, but also it doesn't take, you know, suppliers aren't filling out endless forms, restaurants aren't filling out endless forms, because it's so time consuming, and it's only going to get more time consuming the more data we have. So the question I have is actually around data for collaboration. What kind of data do you think would help you the most if data were shared in terms of really achieving an impact?
Two great questions there.
Well, I'll answer the one that I heard. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm quite interested at the moment. So we've done some work on our carbon, and I'm really interested in, I'm just astonished at the amount of different tons of carbon that you spit out for 50 grams of protein. And generically, that's true. I'm really interested to know what it is on my menu, so we're doing that work right now. But I think that if we can give restaurants and customers easy access to all of that data, even generically, I think it would be great. And I think we all need to be conversant. I think you all need to go out and say, well, I had a steak last night, that was 25 kilos of carbon, so I'm going to not fly around today, because that's a trade-off. That's real. You know, it's 50 billion tons. We've got to get rid of it. We've got to go to zero. And, you know, you can sort of, you know, buy some better cookers for people in Nairobi or something, but that's just offset. It's just not going to work. You have to be really, really cognizant in the way that probably you know how much your dairy milk calories had, but you don't know how many, you know, grams or kilos of carbon you had. We have to be really conversant in that now. So I think that data for me is really critical. We should, I think, Giles, you should have a little calculator on your website, and which tells you all the different things.
A little calculator.
Well, it doesn't have to be that big. It's just a small one. And you know, tell you how much carbon you spit out when you eat a chicken or eat a lamb, and then find, you know, an egg, dairy, and then finally pulses, dal at the bottom, which is very good for you, very good for the planet. So that data, I think, is gold dust. I think we should all have that, all look at it, all be conversant, and we should all lead and convince consumers they need to do that, because that will change the way the hospitality industry spits out carbon and impacts the planet.
So just to reassure you, if you log on to netzero.restaurant, it's already there. It's there. Just go through the process. It'll be fine. Yes. I mean, we have as created a protocol to allow restaurants who are not conversant with carbon and don't have perhaps the understanding that you are to answer some very simple restaurant-y questions to go through, and that will measure the carbon footprint of the restaurant. It will provide a reduction based on science-based targets for that restaurant, and it'll allow you to offset so you can go net zero. All in one go.
20p per bit of chicken. No, it's rubbish.
But I think so that's that is there, and the restaurant can go through that process. I think what's really interesting for me about the data question is that the data is already out there. I had an interesting conversation with Brakes, the supplier, about the information that they have, and then Compass about the information that they have, and so the information is in all these bits, but it's not connected up, and it's certainly not in a helpful way that people can use that information and then make decisions on it. And I think, the hospitality sector is not known for liking data and computers that much, and I think we need to get better at it, and we need to actually have a sort of open data process where we try and draw all the data that actually exists out there in all of these entities and make sense of it in a comparable way, in order that restaurants, rather than the restaurant having to go, well, what's the calorie of this, they can just put in the ingredients and then that it will be calculated from the suppliers that already know that information. So at the moment, too much work is having to be done, as you say, filling out forms, etc., and it's inefficient and it's not working, and too much is having to be done by the restaurant itself. And we need to move to a place where that data is available to make simple and easy solutions for the restaurant, for the diner, and then I think we'll see changes happen much faster.
Thank you.
Lovely conversation. My two cents and recommendations, probably. One of them is, I think if you go to McDonald's, right, every menu has calories you will have when you actually buy something. Why can't we have a CO2 equivalent next to every single product on the menu? Yep. Right, so...
It's coming.
Yeah, that's one thing. The second thing is about why can't we see an year-on-year reduction in the carbon of the business on the website or on the menu?
It's coming. But you're right. I mean, if you're interested in these issues, we need to be telling people, about it. It's only in the last year, through some organisations doing the stuff on their own, but now an open protocol to enable any restaurant to be able to go through that process, to then say what their carbon footprint is, to say how they're reducing it, and that information will be freely available, in order that people can start making decisions based on what's on the menu, what the business is doing, etc. But we are at early stage of this. It's a few leaders in the business, in the sector, that are doing it, and we need to move really fast and really simply in order to get as many of the sector going. But it is there, it's coming, and I think you'll begin to see it in 2022.
Should I jump in?
Two questions in the same direction.
I'm usually told off for being loud, though. Hi, Claire from Blue Water. For those of you who don't know, we're a purpose-led business, always have been, and I hope that we can inspire others. You can be profitable, certainly pre-COVID, anyway, while sticking to our values and reducing carbon emissions, all of which are on the website, reported every year, so I hope we can inspire others to do better. But just on the carbon subject, so I'm daily out there speaking with hospitality businesses, and they come to us because they want to do better by planet, by people, and certainly, in the last few months, I've certainly seen a huge rise in people talking about the planet, which we had that about a couple of years ago with David Attenborough and Blue Planet. I keep calling this now, it's like phase 2, the COP effect, kind of Blue Planet 2. So that we don't ensure that it's like a big group's echo chamber of reducing carbon. What are the top tips, and you touched on it briefly, Giles, about net zero restaurants. What are the top tips you have for helping small hospitality businesses that someone like me can go out there and advocate without fear of, sending someone down a greenwashing path, so that restaurants owners can get an impartial view on how to do better when it comes to reducing their carbon and really avoiding greenwashing and helping them navigate, the minefield that is carbon reduction, when, they might not just even know what that means to begin with. So it's about simplifying, demystifying. And you touched on net zero restaurants, but are there any other different tools and resources available that you would recommend?
Okay, right. There are a bunch of things that every restaurant can do to reduce their carbon, and that's available, and there are, and it should be more available than it is. I do think that it is important, though, that if a restaurant is going to take it seriously, that they need to measure. You need to measure your footprint in order that you can see where the interesting bits lie, and you can. The moment that a restaurant does that, you have such a different conversation than saying, "Oh, you could move some more of your menu options to plant-based or whatever," and they go, "Yeah." But actually, it's like, look, just go through this process, measure your carbon footprint, and then you'll see where you go, "Blimey, is that much versus this?" And that we can definitely do something about that. And it's that process of sort of building your knowledge and understanding in it that actually is what drives people to create the change. So yes, we can have lists, but I think the most important thing is just do it, and you'll see where the impacts are and you need to reduce them.
And I guess just on that, if they then said to me, "But Claire, how do I even start doing that? Who do I go to? What would we say?"
I would slightly probably disagree with what you're saying. In the first sense is actually, because sometimes that can be quite intimidating if you don't have the time and the resource to measure your carbon footprint. I think there's already data there to measure as well. If you look at your EPOS system and see what you sell. One of my biggest things that I would say to people is have more than one bin. You should have 3 bins. You should have one for food, one for general, one for recycling. And that's just shouldn't be questioned. And I think then you can measure, you can see for your own eyes. And I think, when I used to be in Westminster and we had red bags, blue bags, and then food waste. And I could see how much we were spending on red bags per month, how much we were spending on blue, and how much our food waste was cost to take away. And my whole point was we need to be minimising, there shouldn't really be any red. So how can we, breaking it down to that simple is to saying just, see how much, if you separate your waste, what have you got, and how do you deal with it from that point? Because it is a measurement in some ways, but then I think, as you're saying, it might spur the interest to then say, hold on, what about this? How can we then get that information?
So the only thing I'd say is I think your concept of measuring is scary, is that it's going to take loads of time.
It will take a person's time.
And I'm not going to be able to answer the question. And I think that's what we've tried to do, is to simplify that process, enable you to answer it from sort of questions that you can answer rather than questions that you can't answer, in order to give you an approximate view of where that is pretty quickly. So actually, it's not as scary a process, and maybe that's the sort of part of the sell, is actually just try this. It's not that scary. Just go through it. Take you half an hour to get a feel for where the areas of real interest are, and then you feel that you've personalised it to yourself. I think that's the key thing. But yes, there are 10 steps that every restaurant could do, and every restaurant should do, and those should be better known.
Chantal's so practical.
Yeah.
I love how practical Chantal is. I think it's you got to do both. You've got to be practical and then abstract. So.
I love the,
exactly.
the sort of
put some bins up, do some stuff.
The practicality of that one. I'm very conscious of time. Should we do one last question and then?
Hey,
please.
Great. Nice to see you all. I'm Safia. I'm founder and CEO at Club Zero, and we have launched a reuse company. So we build the infrastructure. You're nodding. Maybe you've heard of us. Oh yeah. Oh. So my big observation here tonight is you're all huge food enthusiasts. I think humanly possible that everyone in this room is. But to distribute food, you consume a hell of a lot of packaging. And a recycling bin isn't going to do it. So I love that you pointed it out, but fundamentally, it doesn't work as an infrastructure. So how are you guys tackling that? What discussions are you having? Are you looking at reuse models? Are you genuinely concerned about this? Because you can't inevitably throw millions and millions of dollars, of pounds, of money to try and educate consumers on how to recycle, because fundamentally every single council in this city runs it in a very different way. It's awfully confusing. And then outside London, when you go in regional distribution, you've got all of this single-use packaging. Most of it's never going to get recycled. If it's compostable, it's going into the incinerator. So my question to everyone here is, doesn't that really worry you? Every single meal you get out, every single thing that comes into your kitchen, whether it's bulk, every piece of that packaging fundamentally is not getting recycled. I'd love to try and help, but I really want to know whether this keeps you up at night or not. So,
it keeps me up.
Okay.
And I find it incredibly challenging because I've tried numerous times to get things in reusable packaging that I can refill. COVID definitely put a bit of a halt to the progress that was happening. There is some stuff that's happening. Probably, I would say potentially beverage is a bit further ahead than food. Mm-hmm. Maybe because it's simpler, I don't know. But, reusable kegs, reusable, refillable bottles, etc. It's incredibly hard when it comes to food, I would say. And I would love a solution, so if you have one.
Right.
But I think, that's where collaboration's key as well, because I think if there's more people demanding it, it will hopefully happen.
I'm not sure I have much to add. It does keep me up a bit. I mean, I guess I come back to a couple of things. But one is we're trying in our kitchens to do to get rid of the single-use stuff, and it isn't easy to do because a lot of distribution, as you say, is in that format. I think it also, for me, comes back a bit to, I just hate to think about that floating ocean of plastic in the Pacific. Do you know about that? That one of the lovely sort of Rothschild sons went and had a look at, and it's the size of France. It just rotates, and that's horrific. For me, it comes back to the centrality of the carbon issue as well, which is that we've only got 10 years to fix this. So does it affect that? And to some extent, it does, right? I mean, the single-use packaging is a problem for that. So I think for me, we need to push on all these items. I agree.
I think it's a real place for innovation from outside the sector as well. There's lots of work going on in terms of new packaging, different types of packaging, different models in other sectors. And I think the hospitality sector needs to draw on what's going on in the rest, rather than thinking that it's going to solve it itself. I mean, the fundamental issue is that, if you think about where the real carbon is in a restaurant, it is in the food rather than in the packaging, whereas that is in other sectors, it's much more the packaging, and therefore I think that this hospitality sector needs to draw on the fact that they're putting the time and investment in there. And what the restaurants need to do is really focus in on lowering the carbon that's in the food and the food wastage as their contribution, in a sense, to the innovation, and then draw innovation from other sectors to ensure that you're maximising the change possible.
Yeah, thank you. I'm, as I said just now, conscious of time.
Waving vigorously.
Hi, I'm Marie, CEO of Goldfinger, a sustainable furniture maker for the hospitality industry. And you just said it again, and you touched on it a couple of times, that it's not, yes, there is the food, but it's actually, you're a showcase for what's happening out in the field, but also the interiors and the furniture, there's so much potential carbon reduction in what furniture goes in and what materials you're using. So it was mostly for you, Giles, but in your net zero, because Chantal we're already working with her on making a table for her upcoming restaurant. So I know Chantal's response to this, but with the net zero restaurant, it is the interiors and all of the what goes into the restaurant counted in the carbon footprint of a restaurant beyond what goes in the plate?
Yes.
Fab. Love to hear that.
Fantastic. Can I suggest that I, for my part, don't know about the other three panelists, but I'm very happy to continue conversations up on the third floor, but would like to bring it to a close in this room now. First of all, I want to say thank you very much to the three of you on the panel. Some brilliant contributions there. You know, I think if just to kind of highlight a couple of those from my perspective, that centrality of the carbon issue, I think, for us to face into that, and I think probably an associated point there is that sort of 5 or 6 key priorities that we want to collaborate on across the sector and really shift the dial on all of those things quickly. And then I haven't lost that EBITDA question because we didn't actually answer it. I'm very conscious of that. And I think it's really interesting, but maybe we come back to that separately. I think there is some interesting work going on that question in a number of places. But yeah, thank you very much to all of the three of you. Thank you very much for coming this evening. Thank you for contributing your questions and thoughts. And as I say, I'm happy to continue up on the third floor.